mental health issues, we are sad, we are heartbroken, and we are left helpless in the land of refuge without any option. We cannot help our families back in Afghanistan. That is, I think one of the biggest challenges that refugees, especially refugees from Afghanistan, let's say, they are going through right now. And yeah, part of that, again, the lack of livelihood itself is, I think, one of the other greatest challenges for refugees. Not all refugees, they are being supported by NGOs such as CRS, CWS, or IOM. There are just a few number of refugees who are being supported, and then we have other refugees who are living independently, and then they do not have access to any livelihood. So again, it's a very big challenge for them, and then it creates and causes other challenges, such as, again, mental health issues. And of course, another thing is also the lack of having access to higher education. So refugees, we ourselves, we took the lead and the initiative. We built these learning centers for our kids, but it only provides basic education to kids. But people like myself, who we are in our productive age, we do not have access to higher education. And some of the refugees, they are doing this GED program to just have their high school certificate, and after the graduation, again, they are left without any option, because they do have their high school certificate, but again, the chance of continuing and for higher education is lacking there. These are one of the greatest challenges that refugees in Indonesia, they are right now going through.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I know that the situation in Indonesia is particularly difficult, as is the situation in Malaysia. So I'd like to shift to Naima and to ask really the same question that I put to Humaira, and that is that we've seen a lot of hope with Malaysia over the course of a couple of sequential governments now, that the situation might change for refugees for the better, and then for the worse, and then for the better. And then we saw the horrific response to populations that were seeking asylum or other protection in Malaysia, particularly the Rohingya at the advent of COVID, and the situation with the boats that were refused disembarkation, and the popular xenophobic rhetoric that started to go through Malaysia. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, looking at the fact that we have a long way to go, and sequential governments can really shift the dynamic of a country. If you could talk a little bit about how to progress a movement in a context that does have so many variables that are shifting all of the time, and how you've been able, through your work, to maintain a focus through all of those shifts and changes.
Thank you. I would say that UNHCR never get tired of registering those asylum seekers, but the fact that they are the most vulnerable. And when it comes to protection, they are seen as undocumented. I mean, the entire refugees are recognized as illegal immigrants, but when it comes to protection, sometimes you see women suffering domestic violence or facing sexual assault. So these members are even unable to lodge a report because they fear that they could be arrested by the authority. So it has been a very difficult to the entire refugee community in Malaysia, when the resettlement became less than 1%, for example, and especially for the women and children, it was a real challenge and a struggle to continue to live in Malaysia. So speaking for my community, for instance, when the resettlement rate has decreased, some chose to return their country of origin, while others couldn't afford a plane ticket. So there is a lot of talk about refugees, and it is advocacy programs lately, but the question is how this could be achieved without rights approved. There is no long-term plan to encourage the refugee community in Malaysia, and there's no arrangements that will make it easier for them to stay in Malaysia for a long time. The rest who don't have other options, for example, are the ones who remain suffering here and often ask for support from NGOs and UNHCR. We have, for example, uneducated refugee women, girls, and children who are vulnerable. For example, throughout this COVID season, the living situation turned even worse due to the house evictions, mental health problems, and being unable to pay their rentals and basics. Some single women are at risk, for example, of any forms of violation and abuses from perpetrators, for they don't have a permanent housing. They locate from house to house, begging the families to shelter them a day or two and life goes on like that. So there are very few NGOs who help those cases in the daily basis. However, so we wanted to see more that UNHCR does as a COVID response plan for refugees, which is not much happening. So we would like to see that refugees being included in the policy making, for example, in the Global Refugee Forum. So instead of those people, non-refugee activists or politicians who never face the sort of trauma, displacement, torture that the refugees and asylum seekers are already facing, those people, I would say, they can probably represent refugees as a first line policy setting solution when it comes to policy making for the refugees. And when we want to seek a solution for a victim, I think they should be asked what they think of the solution. They may even share more on what other things happening on the ground when they think their problems could be solved and such. So speaking of how the refugee able to, for example, navigate whenever there is a hatred and xenophobic speech around. I remember some of our Rohingya friends have been hunted down by some members because of they have spoken out loud about the government actions and policies and all that. So most of the refugees are unable to speak out loud about the actions or whatever xenophobic or hatred speech going on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naima. I salute the work that you're doing in Malaysia, especially under the circumstances that you're dealing with there. And you and Humaira before you have both highlighted two, I think, aspects of response that are much too often overlooked. And those are the situation of risk facing women and girls across the board. You have to remember that a refugee population is, of course, a cross-section of any population. So it is going to have vulnerable people within it. And it's a powered relationship and an exploitative one, and one where people are often at risk. And when those risks are realized, do not have recourse to seek accountability for the circumstances that they've been put in. So that's one. Is the particular situation facing women and girls. The other that Humaira mentioned, and it's one that I think is similarly often overlooked or somehow swept to the side, is the critical issue of mental health and how refugees are expected to continue to live in environments that are incredibly challenging to mental health. The situation facing Afghans in particular right now that Humaira mentioned is unbelievably taxing. And we do see not only in Indonesia and Malaysia, but all over the world, refugee suicides, the numbers are extremely high. Depression, anxiety, any number of situations that really present challenges to refugees, and then present challenges for refugees seeking their protection because they are not in a position to be able to effectively present their circumstance due to the effects of that mental health strain. So those are two things, and you're both advocating in different ways, Naima and Myra, about these some of the different issues that you've seen and some of the specific challenges to population. So to move to talking point number 3, I want to move us a little bit into how refugees can influence policy. And, you know, as noted, without rights, refugees are effectively invisible actors in a legal sense, without recognition. So basically, we've seen refugees be sidelined for years in policy discussions. But in recent years, we've seen, particularly in Asia and the Pacific, the building of a movement led by refugees, determined by refugees, you know, funded by the efforts of refugees, you know, really shifting the dialogue. And it's not tokenistic. It's very much a movement that says we, in solidarity as refugees around the globe or as refugees in this region, want to see change. Nothing about us without us, the famous slogan coming out of the refugee advocacy movement. And we want to see it with us in the room, you know, as decision makers, as idea generators. And that goes to your point about asking people who've been, Naima, it goes to your point about asking people who've been through the circumstances what they think of the solutions that are being provided to them. So I want to talk a little bit about refugee-based and refugee-led advocacy. I come from a position of working in NGOs and working in organizations that traditionally have been guilty of sidelining refugees. And I saw the progression of my previous organization through the development of policy within the organization to try and increase the access that refugees have. But I don't think that that's moving fast enough. And so what I'd like to do is ask you, Humaira and Naima, if you could talk a little bit about the refugee communities that you work with, particularly as regards engaging in advocacy and some of the challenges there, because there is a balance of risk. If refugees stick their heads up and protest, they could be detained, they could be deemed to be troublemakers and risk their service provision support. They could be arrested, they could be deported. But if they don't, the situation continues as it has, progressively getting, you know, worse and worse. And so there's a real challenge there. And I'm wondering if you could talk, each of you, a little bit about the populations that you work with and how they see the future of a refugee-led movement and what avenues they see, because those of us working in traditional NGOs are likely blind to those, and those perspectives will be coming from refugee communities. So I'd like to start with you, Naima, and then maybe you, Humaira, if that's all right.
Thank you, Themba. Yeah, first of all, I think refugee leaders need refugee community. The refugee-led organizations, they need to be recognized. That international community should recognize refugee-led organizations, and also and the banking policy that's supportive to the refugee to be self-sustaining and also to be able to not only finance themselves, but also to finance the other lives of the refugees and their determinants of life. Also, I think we like to see that there should be international support that allows refugee legally, for example, they receive the right to work, for example, and I think after receiving the right to work, things will get easier to solve, and refugees will be able to finance their health and housing and everything that basically that refugee needs. Also, we will need an international community to highlight this potential and contribution for refugees to fight the hate and xenophobic, especially from the power and the heart that runs the country. There should be also an expedition of the resettlement of, for example, the women at risk, children, elderly, and also disabled people, we also need to see that there should be opportunities for higher education, because we have seen that the community-led organizations are the ones who are always working and know what's happening on the ground with their refugee members. So there should be like a higher education so that these people know to manage their community centers best. And we would also like to see scaling up the women leadership, because we have seen that, for example, speaking of my community, there's like a 65% are women, girls. So that very enormous percentage we have in the community. I think they are the building block of the community, those women and girls, and most of them are illiterate. So for the ones who have, for example, higher education, they still need a capacity building, and they need to postgraduate studies, for example, or how to work with or set up with the and with an NGOs, or work with the NGOs past. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Naima. I appreciate that. And I'm wondering, Humaira, if you have anything to add from your experience, particularly around how refugee populations and refugee leaders can really be informing the movement for a much more inclusive refugee process.
Timba, first, when we talk about refugee, refugee advocacy inside Indonesia for refugees, it has been always, very challenging. For instance, if we talk about, some of the protests that these refugees, they have formed, in front of UNHCR office for their right. For example, one of the protests that refugees did, it was on 24th of August. Refugees, they face challenges in terms of being accepted, and in terms of they face problems from the officials. Refugees, they have been arrested, they have been detained because they have been protesting, and they have been released back. And when the people, they say that these refugees, they say that we have problems inside Indonesia that we need to issue, and the kind of responses that they have, they hear from the official is that if you're not happy in Indonesia, why don't you go back to your country? This is the kind of response people they hear. And even if they raise their voice, if they gather for a protest, they are being detained, and then the officials, they ask the people to go away, and even they sometimes they get violent. We have we have witnesses, we have the evidence. It's never easy. And the other thing, when we talk about the advocacy that is formed or that is led by refugees, I really think that refugee leadership itself, it needs to be supported. And I think that refugees' participation in the global refugee regime should be considered. We really need to bring refugees in front desk, and along with the other strong voices, they need to raise their voice for and make decision for themselves. And we need to recognize this, and we need to give more focus to that. And I think this way it would be more safer than just gathering and going in front of UNHCR and asking for your right, because then you have to face the law and you have to face the official. And one another problem right now that is going inside the refugee community itself is that the fear that people they have inside them of how doing advocacy can risk the chances of resettlement for them. For example, refugees right now, they are pretty much scared of even having access to some of the facilities. They have been even negotiating about the learning centers and the sports and all the other facilities that we have inside Indonesia for them. The refugees think that this might cause the lack of resettlement for them, and this might cause UNHCR to shift their focus from refugees inside Indonesia, and they should prioritize other refugees outside Indonesia. I think that's one of the biggest challenge that right now it's going on, because refugees, they of course, they do want to do, the advocacy for their rights, but they are very, very scared that how this will impact, their life, and especially the resettlement process for them. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think that these are really critical perspectives, and I'd like to turn it now to Tristan. And Tristan, I know you through work around refugee participation and the efforts that you've put in the past through affiliations with Act for Peace or with Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network or with others to discuss things like the Global Refugee Forum and how to advance advocacy through those larger policy structures, global policy structures. And so I'm wondering if you could, for the benefit of the people who are on the call, just talk a little bit about where we are now in terms of the we being the non-refugee advocacy contingent, where we are now and where we came from and where we need to be as non-refugees to ensure that refugee participation is real, it's substantial, it's substantive, it's informed, and it's effective. And if you have insights from the work that you've been doing on what has and has not worked in that regard, as pertains to NGOs and policymakers for providing that space for refugees to fill.
Thanks, Temba. Yes, this is a topic that's close to my heart, and I'll try and answer those questions as quickly as possible while there are a lot of them. So just starting with the history a little bit. It is often assumed that refugees were largely excluded from decision-making processes in the development of early international refugee law and policy. However, this is not really and entirely the case. For example, the idea of creating a binding international treaty with respect to refugees was first proposed by refugee Jacques Rubenstein in 1927 on behalf of what you would now consider to be a refugee-led organisation. The first High Commissioner of UNHCR had lived experience of displacement, something that hasn't been repeated since with any other subsequent High Commissioners of UNHCR. We also saw several staff members with inside UNHCR in the 1950s having lived experience of displacement. Now, since this early history, the refugees have largely been excluded from decision-making processes that affect them. And I think there's a transition away from this. In that period of growth of the humanitarian regime, as well as the movement of refugees away from Europe to other parts of the world. And so by governments, donors and humanitarians alike, refugees have been seen as helpless, passive victims, rather than actors of change in their own right. And what you're referring to is, I think, the witnessing of a new emergence of advocacy by refugees, advocating for their inclusion in decision-making processes at all levels of governance. This has already had some impact. It has led to the formation of new regional and international refugee-led networks, such as the Global Refugee-Led Network. And it has also led to the acknowledgement in international law that refugees should be included in decision-making responses that affect them, particularly in the United Nations Global Compact on Refugees, which states committed to in 2018. This work, however, I think I'll speak optimistically, is still in transition, but we see systemic failures to ensure participation in practice. In particular, when we get down to the nitty-gritty of different decision-making areas, such as law and policy making, deliberations on durable solutions, and program and service delivery on the ground, we still see refugees often excluded from these decision-making processes. For example, among the 31 tripartite agreements that have been signed since 1996 for the voluntary repatriation of refugees to their country of origins, these have all been made by the country of origin, the country of refuge, and UNHCR, with no refugee-led organisation being included as a stakeholder in these processes, and very little consultation with refugees in these processes as well. Similarly, in resettlement, both at an individual level and at a group level, we see widespread exclusion of refugees in these processes. Refugees can often attest to that they rarely know when they're being considered for resettlement at an individual level. If they are considered for resettlement, they then rarely have a say in where they'll be resettled. And beyond that, in the development of resettlement policy at the international level, there has been widespread exclusion of refugees in these processes as well. So the development of UNHCR's resettlement handbook, the annual tripartite consultations on resettlement have often excluded refugees. However, there have been some small gains in this in recent years, particularly since 2019 onwards. Non-refugee advocates, I think, have a substantial role to play in this, particularly in working in collaboration with these refugee-led organisations and networks to enhance meaningful refugee participation. And I think, as Humaira and Naima commented on this call, this is something that's actively sought from refugee-led organisations on the ground. Additionally, I think we also all have an obligation to interrogate whether our legal and policy frameworks are sufficient for ensuring the meaningful participation of refugees across these range of decision-making scenarios. When we can compare the international refugee regime to the consultative frameworks of other rights regimes, such as those related to Indigenous peoples or persons with disabilities, it is clear that more could be done in this space. And finally, I think we all need, the non-refugee advocates also need to keep in check our own privileges and biases and reflect on them constantly. We all have an obligation to address and overcome systems of oppression. Thank you.
Excellent. An excellent recap of where we are now and how we got there. And something I find very, very interesting about that response is that it does situate refugee participation within that larger context. And I do think that one of the things that we often overlook is that the fact that refugees have been advocating for themselves since the existence of refugees. And it's the fault of others not allowing for that space or shutting that space down actively that has so often led towards such exclusive circumstances for refugees, and the understanding that a lot of these ideas were coming out, at least in the formation of refugee law, from refugees themselves or efforts by refugee-led organizations, although they weren't termed that at the time, is really poignant in this to demonstrate that this is part of a much larger movement, and that we're now facing a new shift in that and a new visibility in that. And that movement is moving us forward. And that brings me to our fourth and final talking point, which is moving forward. And I think we've covered a lot of the questions that I have here around moving forward. So I don't think we'll need to spend a whole lot of time on this section. And I think that the time would be preferentially applied, at least in my behalf, towards a question and answer session, and make sure that participants have the opportunity to put some questions to the panelists. I've seen some already coming into the chat. If you do have questions, please put them in there, and we'll do our best to answer them before we're out of time today. But basically, I'd like to take these remaining minutes before the Q&A to discuss what kind of reform is really needed. We've heard a couple of examples: right to work, effective legal frameworks for protection, these types of things, the growing of the refugee-led movement. But from the perspective of both refugees and non-refugees, and I appreciate the balance that we have on this panel, how do we achieve that core mission of refugee protection in Southeast Asia specifically? And I'd like to hear first from Naima and Humaira, just one or two sentences of what needs to happen now regarding the context that you're in, and then from Tristan, again, just one or two sentences of what you would like to see, what you think would be a real shift in the coming years in refugee protection in the coming in the region. Maybe Humaira, if you could go first.
Okay. One thing that I've been thinking about is, I mean, that can be a solution for refugees, while they are waiting for resettlement, is that the government of Indonesia, should consider issuing refugee temporary stay permit cards to refugees while they are living in transit country, because these could solve a lot of issues that refugees they have right now. This temporary card is taken help refugees to work inside Indonesia and to have access to their most many of the rights that they don't have access right now. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I think right now there are the chances or the possibilities are a lot there. As I said, if you're talking about employment, today employment is very much possible with technology. Why the global companies, global businesses, they don't consider refugees, employ refugees as their employee. And as well as if we talk about education again, today it is possible through online learning. Refugees, while they are living as a refugee inside the transit country, they can still study in any part of the world through the scholarship. I think for now, these are some of the solutions that we can work towards and we can consider as a solution for refugees.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Amara. Naima, do you have a few senses of what you think need to be priority focus areas moving forward?
Yeah, thank you. I don't have too much positivity in Malaysia that unless one rights for refugee recognized, because as educated refugees we are struggling to receive some income, but it's still very challenging for us. And what we can do is being a translator, doing some interpretation for the NGOs. Even UNHCR doesn't hire the refugees, except the stateless community members. So we can, foretell what the other uneducated refugee members are going through and how they will be their lives for the coming years. So I would say there should be expedition of resettlement. Because some educated refugees or refugees with capacity can still have some opportunities to go to the third country, as long as the country of asylum is not trying us to or recognizing that we can contribute to the country. So we have some people with some members who have relatives, for example, in overseas, so they don't know the real process. So there is a less of cooperation between UNHCR, because they don't provide lawyers and the sponsor and the refugee community members. So because I think the pattern will at least be easy, and so many refugees will get resettled if that's being expedited. And the very less university accept refugees also a scholarship, but they still require visa, which the refugee members can't afford to pay themselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naima. And Tristan, from your perspective as someone who's really been working on the larger picture in terms of policy and in terms of engagement at a regional and global level, what would you like to see in terms of advancing the situation facing refugees in Southeast Asia in the coming few years?
Thanks, Temba. Yes, I guess from the international perspective, we need to recognize that the international refugee regime is failing to meet its core objective to providing protection to people in need. When I reflect on the kind of title of this session, looking at beyond resettlement, I still believe that so long as we have international borders and sovereign jurisdictions, the three durable solutions of resettlement, local integration, and voluntary repatriation to the country of origin in conditions of safety and dignity are still relevant and will continue always have a role to play in the future of the refugee regime. Nevertheless, there are other options that can be pursued in addition to these. As mentioned in the comments about complementary pathways to protection through education, through work visas, etc. These are important as well. We need to address the nexus between refugees and migration more thoroughly to look at other opportunities for movement with increased mobility. And then on the ground, I think we need to support refugee-led organisations with their work. We need to support refugees in their advocacy. We need to also address the political and socio-cultural aspects of refuge to counter xenophobia, for example, and to highlight the potential of displaced populations. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tristan. I very much appreciate that. We've now come to the end of the talking points. We've heard a tremendous variety of points made, not only on the particular circumstances facing refugees in Indonesia and Malaysia, but also the region and the world, and how we might be able to move forward, advancing from some of the challenges that we've heard about. So I can really appreciate the breadth of this conversation. But I also appreciate, how a lot of these challenges are challenges we've heard before. And a lot of these opportunities are opportunities that we continue to talk about and struggle to advance. But I do want to close the formal part of this panel by saying that it's through this continued effort, while it may seem glacial in speed at some points, where we might see a sudden advance somewhere else, it's through that maintained initiative at the very local level, at the national level, at the regional level, at the international level, and at the personal level. So I really appreciate the three of you for joining this panel. And I appreciate, of course, the hosts of the conference for inviting me to be a part of this. We have not a whole lot of time, but we are hoping to extend, if people are willing to stay, for another 10 or 15 minutes. And I'd like to make sure that we have at least 3 questions answered, one for each of the panelists. So we're certainly willing to keep taking questions, and panelists, please do take a look at the chat. If there's a question to you in there, feel free to answer it there, just in the circumstance that we don't have enough time to answer it verbally. But the first one I'd like to direct to Humaira. It's the first question that came in. And it says, Sister Humaira, based on your experience with Jakarta Bersatu, how do you navigate the uncertainty regarding right to work, and what kind of challenge do you face due to the situation, the legal situation around rights to work?
Thank you, Dia, for your question. Okay, if I again specifically talk about uncertainty when it comes to having, the right to work in Indonesia. Of course, it has always been very challenging, and it is still challenging, even for an organization like Jakarta Bersatu Project. We have to be really, really careful with what we are doing, so that we do not, risk violate the laws of Indonesia, or we do not put our participants in any risk. We have been trying, for I think more than 6 months, trying to just, register Jakarta Bersatu Project officially inside Indonesia, and that has been very challenging. We are still on hold and still trying to explore, the possibilities. Refugees who inside Indonesia who are trying to have, kind of independent business, they have been, detained. They have been caught by the immigration, and they have put into prison, into jail, because of doing business inside Indonesia. Those are, the kind of risk that we are facing. And regarding what we are doing, I think for refugees for now, until there is no, until there are any changes made into Indonesian government's policy towards refugees. The safest way for us is, helping refugees through through refugee-based projects, rather than, refugees having independent businesses like opening a shop that can just, put them into detention center. So we know that we right now, for example, we cannot support refugees as official, businessmen or official people who has their own business, but we are trying to find the safe way for them, where they can practice their skills, and then using their ability and skill they can earn an income. And we are making that possible through, of course, again, our collaboration with local companies, local NGOs, and organization. Being partnered with local organization for now, I think, is one of the safest ways for now for refugees to work on livelihood and to kind of be an answer to uncertainty of having access to livelihood and being able to have an income right now. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I just want to quickly note that I've had a message that Naima has had to leave the session for other meetings. So I'm saddened that we can't get to some of the questions that are directed to Naima, but I'm sure that we'll be able to follow up if people have very specifics that they'd like to know about the work that she's doing, the organization that she's a part of, context within which she does that work. So I guess in that case, I'll move on to Tristan and a question that's come in for you, Tristan, from Jean. To Tristan Hartley. In the context of building an inclusive society or governance, what type of activities or potential ways to have refugees involved in the decision-making process, particularly on the decisions that have a direct impact on them? What avenues do you see is how I read this question? What are the potential ways to get those refugees involved in those rooms, being part of those decisions?
Thanks, Temba. So I guess this is a question that needs to be addressed holistically. And one of the ways that I think we should do that is by considering all the decision-making areas where refugees should have a say in the decision-making processes. And I would argue that they are all decisions which materially impact upon the human rights of refugees. Now, in terms of types, that could take a variety of forms. It would include law and policy making at the international, the national, the local level. It would include participation in durable solutions, but also in other relocation decisions. That's where decisions where refugees are transferred from one jurisdiction to another. They often occur on a less than durable basis. For example, when refugees are moved from, say, Australia to other countries for offshore processing. This is also occurring in Europe. And a third area of decision-making that I think is really important is the participation of refugees in program and service delivery on the ground. And that could be a whole range of activities, whether it's relating to health, education, economic opportunities and entrepreneurial activities. In terms of supporting refugees to be able to participate, that once again needs to take a variety of forms. We need to obviously dedicate funds to the task and recognise that just asking refugees to voluntarily do so is ethically problematic, but also it's unlikely to lead to the outcomes that the regime needs to see. Often one of the barriers to participation that refugees experience is they'll receive criticisms that their participation is not representative enough. Even though, for example, I may not be, questioned as to kind of, from whose perspective I'm speaking on, in the various fora that I may speak in. But it is a criticism that is often labelled against refugees and refugee-led organisations quite problematically. And I'd say it's particularly problematic because external stakeholders rarely support the enabling of representative bodies within refugee communities. There's a general blanket dismissal or a lack of willingness to support the political agency of refugees. You see in international instruments a willingness to some extent to support the economic potential of refugees, which is often framed within ideas of self-reliance. But when it comes to the political agencies of refugees, that's often cast aside or overlooked or just not discussed at all. So even in the Refugee Convention, there is very little that mentions the political rights of refugees. Even when we look at solutions, resettlement is seen as a great solution, but when you look at the way it's defined by UNHCR, it leads to an outcome of permanent residence, but not necessarily citizenship in all examples. And yet citizenship is really the only way to restore the political rights of refugees in third countries. So there's numerous barriers there that we need to address holistically.
Thank you so much for that. You've touched on citizenship there at the end, and the idea of advancing enjoyment of those fundamental human rights holistically. Shifting from refugee-specific rights to fundamental human rights. There's a discussion that you've referenced, Tristan, in the chat about how to advance refugees. I'll omit the word protection because I think that there's some challenges in this. Through alternate means, complementary pathways, humanitarian visas, in the absence of opportunities for resettlement, and in the absence, sometimes willful, policy-based resistance to allowing for integration. And of course, given the situation that a lot of refugees face with a maintained risk, keeping the idea of repatriation from becoming a realistic option. What can civil society, NGOs and individuals do to push forward some of these alternate paths? And what do you see, Tristan, as some of the potential problematics of those paths? And Humaira, if you have anything to add, of course, feel free to jump in as well.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of potential in relation to exploring complementary pathways to protection. Indeed, with the absence of the traditional durable solutions available to most refugees around the world, this is an alternative way where potentially there may be solutions which otherwise would not exist. So we need to put, dedicate attention towards addressing that. One of the models that often gets considered as a positive framework is looking at community sponsorship. So this is a model that's emerged particularly in Canada, but there's examples in other parts of the world as well. And this is where the community can participate in supporting the resettlement of refugees to third countries. It's been shown to have positive influences in building community support for refugees within that particular place and countering xenophobia. And I guess in terms of the problematics that you talk about, there is also that question, and I think even in such a positive scheme like community sponsorship, where we need to consider the language there and consider whether the process itself has been truly consultative with refugees involved in that process as well. So to what extent do refugees support the idea of being sponsored, and the label sponsorship, for example? I think we need to reflect upon this. But yes, broadly, I think we need to consider complementary pathways, but we also need to take stock that they should not necessarily replace the traditional durable solutions. States have a fundamental obligation to support refugees seeking asylum in their countries of asylum, and so that needs to be supported, and we need to advocate for those work rights and education rights in those countries, and not just suggest that there'll be alternative pathways as well. So it's a complex mixture of solutions that needs to be employed.
Thank you so much, and I can certainly appreciate the number of challenges ahead, but also the opportunities. It's been an absolute pleasure to have the three of you on the panel today. we're coming to a close. I apologize that we haven't been able to get through to all of the questions that are in the chat. Please feel free to continue to put questions in there. Panelists, please feel free to continue to respond there if you're so inclined. I've seen a note from the organizers that there is a feedback form that they're hoping people will fill out. There's a link in the chat. But I would just like to say again, thank you so much to Tristan, Humaira, and Naima for being here and bringing such valuable perspectives to this discussion. I'd like to thank Zico, who's worked really hard in the background to make sure that this happens. And I'd like to thank all of you, the participants, for being here. And with that, I'll hand it over to Zico.
Thank you, Themba. So yes, like Themba said, we are coming to our end of the session. I would like again, thank you to our esteemed speaker, Sister Humaira, Tristan, and Sister Naima, who already left us for another appointment. And also for Themba for excellent moderating. I would say high appreciation for all of you. So just a little bit closing remarks that we are still going to have another session today. Please visit our conference website. At 1 o'clock, we are going to have a thematic session, part 2, space and place in the everyday life of the refugees and host communities. So please also attend the session and register for it. And also, we will have what you call the event recap on our social media. So if you miss this session, you can see the event recap there, and also we will be posting the session on our YouTube channel. So that being said, thank you so much for participating in this event. Thank you so much for your questions and appreciation. So we will see you in another occasion. Thank you so much.